Okay, great. Good morning, everyone. Afternoon, also evening for quite a lot of you. So thank you for joining from wherever you are in the world. I know that we have people calling in from the United States, from Europe, from South Asia, from East Africa, from other parts of Sub-Saharan Africa, and probably other parts of the world that I'm not sure about in our audience here. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. And also wanted to recognize that a colleague just informed me that today is International Mother Tongue Day. So it's pretty appropriate that this event is falling on this day of the year. So it's great to have everyone here. We're going to go ahead and get started just to stay within time. To briefly introduce myself, my name is Maytel Kupfer. I have been managing this research project on the policy side for the last year in partnership with our partners, Digital Futures Lab and Design Beku, as well as with the generous support of the Internet Society Foundation. So thank you so much for calling into our virtual launch of our research and panel discussion about the use of non-dominant or low resource languages online. We are hoping to discuss the research project and also have an important panel discussion between a few different stakeholders on this issue. But first, let me introduce the project and then hand it over to introduce our partners and our funding partner. So the Are We Together project, we are hoping to understand the impact of languages on the usability, accessibility, trustworthiness, growth, and moderation of digital platforms through a mixed method cross-regional comparative study. We did this data collection in both East Africa, Ethiopia, Tanzania, and Uganda, as well as South Asia in India. And we came out of this project with specific recommendations for technologists and developers with the goal of having a more inclusive internet for everyone. We also created a microsite of content with a literature review as a framing paper, case studies of each country that we did data collection and analysis in, and a design brief to create principles for developers and stakeholders to consider when integrating non-English or non-dominant languages into their online platforms or content. So today we're going to be introducing the project and some of our findings from that project, as well as the implications of that, and then having a panel discussion moderated by one of our advisory board members, Kola Tubosan. And then we will also have time for audience question and answer at the end. But to move things along, I'm going to pass things over to my colleague, Philip Ayazika at Policy, to introduce who Policy is, followed by Arjita Mittal from Digital Futures Lab to talk about their work. And then we will pass things over to Shana Robinson to provide some opening remarks. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Shana, and thank you so much, everyone. I can't seem to turn on my video, so I'll just go for it. Again, good afternoon to everyone. Good evening, good morning from wherever you tuned in. My name is Philip Ayazika. I'm based in Kampala. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar hosted by Policy and partners as Digital Futures and Internet Society Foundation, like you're going to hear from them. I'll just take a minute to speak about Policy. We are an award-winning East African Feminist Civic Technology Collective. Our work and research spans across the use and the implementation of data and technology to engineer social change. In the recent past, we have researched ways through which Africans can take back control of their data and reimagine new ways of tech ownership. And today, as we'll delve into this discussion to understand the experiences of non-English speaking users, I want to explore, and as we explore, of course, the key design elements for a more inclusive internet, I want to implore us all to take a moment to reflect on the role of language in shaping our understanding of the world around us. And of course, as Maytal has said, Are we together is a rhetorical phrase that we normally use here in East Africa, and it represents the adaptation of English to local contexts. It is a statement to the resilience and the creativity of African communities who have historically navigated the complexities of the language, which is English, and culture to make sense of the world. So through this webinar, we hope to honor the richness and diversity of African cultures and languages, and explore ways in which we can build a more inclusive and later on an accessible digital ecosystem that values and celebrates these differences. I encourage you all to participate in this conversation, this very timely conversation, and share your perspectives and experiences as we all work towards creating a more equitable future for all. Thank you so much again for joining us, and over to you, Metal.
Thank you so much, Philip. Let me pass it over to my colleague Arjita to introduce the work of Digital Futures Lab. Or sorry, Sasha or Arjita, please go ahead. Thank you.
I can quickly introduce DFL and then pass on to Sasha, who would be a much better person to talk about our work in a lot more depth. So DFL, Digital Futures Lab, is an interdisciplinary research collective. We're based out of Goa in India, and our work is to interrogate the complex interactions between technology and society in the global South. We mainly focus on evidence-based research, public engagement, and participatory foresight methods to work towards pathways to equitable, safe, and just digital futures. We're a team of interdisciplinary researchers and practitioners with trainings across political science, law, economics, engineering, and social work. And this also informs the different verticals we have at DFL, which also range from AI to platform governance to future of work to digital rights. I think I'll pass on to Sasha, who can go into a little bit more depth about our work.
Arjita did quite a good job of covering the gamut of our work as well. But yeah, just to go into a little bit more detail and how it is that Digital Futures Lab attempts to do research work a little bit differently. Our work expands more than just policy responses, which is a part of what we do on a day-to-day, but we also are looking at incorporating futures methodologies and public engagement sort of approach to our work. So how do we make our work a lot more engaging, not just to academic and policy circles, but also to a larger public that may or may not be in the know about their data, their rights, the way that AI and platforms might be impacting their work. So our work has ranged from anywhere to the sort of digital rights of women online to responsible AI practices in Indian agriculture and health. So happy to take more questions about DFL's work if anyone would like to connect after, but I will now let the panel proceed.
Thank you so much, Sasha and Arjita. So we are now going to proceed to opening remarks from Shana Robinson, who is representing the Internet Society Foundation at this event. And this project was generously supported with a grant by the Internet Society Foundation. So over to you, Shana, and thank you so much for being here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm really thrilled and happy and excited to be here, mainly for two reasons. The first reason is that a few years ago, I actually worked at Policy, and it was a wonderful experience. And I'm so happy to come back and see all of the great folks who I used to work with, all of my friends and colleagues, to see the great work that Philip is doing, and Bonita and Nima and the team there. It's really exciting, and to see that organization grow and expand to focus on all the wonderful research projects that you're currently undertaking. The second reason why I'm excited is because I think this work is really critical. I think it's really important, especially as the internet continues to grow and expand and to develop around the world. It's really important that we continue to ask questions about who it excludes, who it leaves out, and who it erases. And so I think this project is a wonderful example of how we can continue to have that conversation, how we can continue to bring that conversation to the center of internet development, And I look forward to hearing the great outputs that come from the research that's happened. I will say, if others on the call are interested or curious to know about the work of the Internet Society Foundation, if you have other projects or similar projects that you'd like to seek out funding for, please follow us on our website, isocfoundation.org, to learn more about funding opportunities. So that's all I'm going to say. Thanks so much, and I look forward to the talk today.
Thank you so much, Shayna. Really appreciate it. So what if, Bata, we could go back to the agenda slide for today. It's 2 slides before. Thank you. Yeah. So today we have an hour and a half for this event, which is not nearly enough time to unpack all of the issues and interesting facts about language use online, but we are going to try our best to fit everything that we can within this time frame. So today we're going, as I mentioned before, we're going to have a brief introduction, which my colleagues already have covered, and who we are. Would also thank you to Shayna for those opening remarks. From here, I, along with some support from my India colleagues, are going to give an overview of the research and our findings. And then from there, we will jump into a panel discussion with representatives from Policy, Digital Futures Lab, Design Beku, and someone from Whose Knowledge to also represent other work being done on language use online. And then we're going to open it up to an audience Q&A for anyone who also wants to join the discussion. So without further ado, I'm just going to go ahead into the overview of our project. So if we could go ahead 2 slides. So we start out our research with wondering about what do we exactly know about language use online? And the next slide is going to give us a little quiz for us to really understand what context we are working in. So I wasn't able to configure this with the Zoom quiz feature, but I welcome people to write in the chat what they think the answers to any of these questions are, and to think a bit about the significance of that. So for example, we have how many African languages are supported by Apple's operating system. So not just keyboard, but actual operating software within like your iPhone or computer. How many African languages could you actually find support for? That's one question. 2, how many African and South Asian languages does Zoom support for direct translation services? So oftentimes Zoom has a service where in an event like this, I could have my English speech translated directly to another language for the use and understanding of many different users. But how many languages are actually supported by this service? And then lastly, what percentage of internet content is in English? So I'm going to give folks a second to think about it. And then we are going to proceed. Okay, I see some interesting responses here. I think people I think most folks are understanding the trend that is going on here, but I'll give it another second. Yeah. Okay. So as much as I would love to have a full trivia round about this, I'll just go ahead and go through the answers of these questions. And as we've kind of alluded to, no African languages are supported by Apple's operating system, absolutely none. On Zoom, there are about 20 languages supported by their direct translation services, but none of those are any South Asian or African languages, not even Hindi or Kiswahili or any commonly spoken languages on either continent. So absolutely none. And then number 3, this is actually a very interesting question and answer in terms of contextualizing our work. 60% of all internet content as of 2022 is in English. This is compared to 80% a decade ago. However, the remaining 40% of internet content is split primarily between 10 other languages, such as French, Mandarin, Spanish, Arabic, and very dominant and high resource languages online, with a very small other percentage being relegated for these other languages that we are talking about today, for example. And I think a very important framing of this is that only 16% approximately of the world's population speaks English or uses English as their native or mother tongue, as their first language. So these are just things that I want us to think about as we move through this research together, as I'm presenting to you in English and not in another language, as the content is written in English, as the interface we're interacting with is written in English. So without further ado, I'm going to dive right into it. So next slide, please. So as we alluded to earlier, Indigenous knowledge is often erased or forgotten in favor of dominant or majority language and expression, including in our online space. So this is a huge reflection and has been an ongoing theme in our work of digital colonialism, which is where American and other Western multinationals such as Meta, Twitter, Zoom, for example, any of these application or software companies are exerting control over the global South by concentrating digital power into corporations, which is tech hegemony. So a lot of internet users, including in the regions of study, do not access the internet using their local language or mother tongue, but they use a language imposed on them by colonialism or languages that are better resourced for online use. Next slide, please. So as a result, users who do not speak or know English are increasingly separated from the digital world, which is an indicator of the increasing digital divide in our society. So our research is aiming to investigate that. Next slide. So over the course of the last year, we have been pursuing a research project exploring the following objectives through our case study research in India, Uganda, Ethiopia, and Tanzania. We are trying to understand how do predominant languages that digital platforms use impact the access, usability, and safety of platforms and their content. We also wanted to know how do users perceive trustworthiness based on languages of digital content? What are the barriers for users and content creators that communicate in local languages? And what are the potential biases and blind spots in how platforms may moderate contents in local languages? What are the recommendations that we can provide to developers to improve this accessibility and inclusivity of digital content? Next slide, please. So we distilled all those objectives down into a very simple research question of asking, what are the experiences and challenges of non-English speakers using digital platforms? So because this was a very qualitative and experience-based study, we did a case study methodology focusing on South Asia, India, and East Africa, which we selected Tanzania, Uganda, and Ethiopia. So we were understanding through the surveying and documenting of language use online in Ethiopia, Tanzania, Uganda, and India. This was done through a user experience lens to understand the non-English user experience online. So next slide, please. So to frame this a bit better, the internet reinforces the global status of English but also promotes linguistic pluralism. It's a bit of a hypocrisy because we have over 7,000 spoken languages worldwide, yet only about 150 are supported in Unicode, which is what we use for text, emojis, and other things online. And as I said earlier, 60% of web pages are in English, with the remaining majority being in dominant, primarily Western languages, aside from maybe Mandarin or Arabic. Certain languages, mostly indigenous or endangered languages, are crowded out of digital spaces. And as the literature has said, and you can read more in our framing paper, the language barrier is arguably as critical as the connectivity barrier, such as the cost of data or access to things like smartphones and laptops. So we can see that global digital platforms are not adapted for diverse contexts in different areas of access, usability, and safety. Next slide, please. So just to briefly go over our methodology, we were trying to understand the use and experience of language speakers and then examine their user experience on different platforms based on the popularity in a given context. Because of course, in Kampala or Dar es Salaam or Addis Ababa, there are different platforms and applications that are used differently in those contexts, and we don't want to generalize between those. So we looked at e-hailing service providers, e-commerce delivery personnel, market vendors, online entrepreneurs, influencers, bloggers and journalists, linguists, and students. And we conducted focus group discussions with these different user groups. In addition, on the East Africa side, we also tapped different bloggers and journalists to write ethnographic diaries to provide multiple weeks of first-person data on how they interacted online using different languages in their lives and in what context they would use that. We also conducted key expert interviews with representatives from applications and platforms such as Rocket Health in Uganda, Imata, which it supports farmers using applications in Uganda, among others. I'll let Arjita or Padmini chime in with a bit of the India methodology.
Hi, I'm Padmini. So I'm happy to just talk a little bit about the methodology we used in India. So we also spoke to, we also did a couple of expert interviews as well, but most of our research and data was taken from conversations we had using focus group discussions with users from urban and peri-urban areas. They were often marginalized by caste, class, economic status, or gender, and so therefore had very kind of specific issues that they would face as a consequence of those disadvantages. They wouldn't be proficient in English, or they'd be barely proficient in English, but would usually have two Indian languages, usually their mother tongue and another language in their capacity. And they would also be using feature phones as well as smartphones. But we were, as Metal said earlier, we have been treating this as a design question as well. So when we're talking about how a non-English user navigates a mobile phone, it's also a question as to how they work with the UX copy, the copy that is used in order to navigate and understand how to move through the interface. Over to you, Mehta.
Thank you. And before I move forward into the findings, I just want to note a few limitations of this study. Of course, we were limited by space and time in the sense that, at least I can speak on the East Africa component of our study, we focused primarily on a lingua franca, or a unifying language in the countries of study. So in Ethiopia, we focused primarily on Amharic. In Tanzania, that was Swahili. And then in Uganda, that was Luganda, just to understand the prominence of specific languages and whether they are elevated above others and the dynamics of that within a given context. And because of that, language is a very politicized issue in the regions of study, and we are very aware of that. Lastly, we understand that qualitative research, especially in this scenario, is not generalizable across all contexts. Of course, future research would really benefit from an accompanying content analysis of maybe different platform use and language incidents on those platforms. And that could potentially occur in a different study. Lastly, I just want to mention that time also meant we were not able to conduct this webinar and publish what we are sharing here in a language other than English. This is the most glaring indicator of the importance of our work. The language that we communicate our findings in and influence stakeholders in is not the language that the majority of our respondents and contributors to this work converse and use in daily life. So I will now move to the findings briefly. Next slide, please. So in Uganda, we engaged with informal economy workers ranging from taxi drivers, motorcycle drivers, and delivery drivers to market vendors, students, journalists, bloggers, and farmers. So lots of different characters and respondents who had both similar and different experiences. So this was in Luwero, Kampala, and Gulu, so largely urban and peri-urban areas of Uganda. And one of the most important things we have to understand in the Ugandan context is that the colonial legacy of the English language in Uganda is still very strong. And as a result, many users default to English to cross language barriers between regions or ethnic groups, rather than trying to speak in their local language, especially online. Different applications were also viewed as needing or requiring English. Some of our respondents noted that Twitter and LinkedIn felt more elite and thus required English rather than more casual applications such as WhatsApp or Facebook. In that same vein, English was also cited as easier to use online than local languages such as Ronyankole or Luganda, simply because of the way that keyboards work and applications run in. Lastly, we also saw this across all country case studies that users code switched, often combining phrases and colloquialisms from different languages to make a point or appeal to certain audiences, depending on who you're speaking to or trying to communicate with online. Luganda was used, for example, in certain social situations and is based on the comfort level of who a person is talking to. A lot of younger Ugandans that we've spoken to, especially our bloggers that wrote our ethnographic diaries, do not speak their mother tongue fluently, especially if they are writing it. As a result, one of our respondents interspersed words in Luganda or Ronyankole in the same sentence as English. So just a brief overview of what we found in Uganda. Next to Tanzania. So we also looked at rural and urban groups in Dar es Salaam and Mwanza. This also included farmers, agribusiness owners, students, entrepreneurs, informal economy workers, also Uber drivers, Bolt drivers, so different ride-sharing apps in the country. The majority of Tanzanians speak Kiswahili because it was designated as a national language after independence in order to unify. So again, this is an indicator of the political legacy of languages and why they might be elevated over others. In this context, language was cited as the biggest limitation for using applications, because when an average Tanzanian buys their first smartphone, they cannot connect to Facebook or WhatsApp or use the phone if they don't speak English. They might need a family member or friend to set up everything for them so they can use the device, because everything comes in English as a default. In that same vein, drivers that we talked to preferred certain applications if they had in-app translation, of which we saw that Bolt had it over Uber, so then drivers would prefer that. Tanzania also has the unique aspect of having more locally grown applications, especially by the government, where Swahili is upheld as a government language in terms of accessing official services and things like that. Similar to the Ugandan context, users mix Swahili and English depending on the word or message they want to convey. One of our respondents noted that Swahili is a very young language. I'm putting that in quotes in the context of vocabulary. So there's a lot of slang, but then certain words that are coming in from the English language or other language don't have an equivalent in Swahili. So if someone is struggling to express themselves, they might automatically revert to using English. So of course, the preferred language of use online is really dependent on people's geographic location and their audience, whether it is family or business. Some people prefer to use their mother tongue, Chaga or Sukuma, on WhatsApp or Facebook if they're talking to their family or friends, but then they might switch to Swahili to reach a wider audience. Next slide, please. So Ethiopia is also a unique case because it is our only case in the East Africa case study group where the majority language does not use a Latin script. Amharic uses the Ge'ez script because of the language that is primarily spoken in Ethiopia. Again, in Ethiopia, we were only able to conduct data collection in Addis Ababa. So of course, our data is pretty biased here. Addis has the highest internet penetration and smartphone ownership in a country where over 80% of the population lives in rural areas. So we know that this data is only representative of a certain slice of the population. So we talked to different people such as linguists, gig economy workers, students, and journalists. So in this context, users often struggle to use Amharic keyboards that are being introduced due to a poor interface. So people often resort to transliteration, voice messages, and other things like that to adapt, even if they wanted to write in Amharic originally. So this language support is very limited, and it's often only supporting Amharic, and then we have a lagging focus on other very common languages in Ethiopia, such as Tigrinya and Oromo. Additionally, an ongoing issue in Ethiopia that respondents were keenly aware of is that algorithms to detect hate speech in Amharic or other languages spoken in Ethiopia are not adapted to the context and often only good at detecting hate speech or problematic content that is written in English or Latin script. Lastly, we understand, and our respondents' answers reflect, that language choice and what language you use when interacting online is very political and reflects in how well these languages are resourced online. Younger generations were encouraged to use English instead of Amharic. English is very valued and associated with upward mobility and opportunity. And as a result, there's a split between using Amharic or English for convenience, even when both languages may have been available or easily used on a given platform. So I'm going to pass it over to my India colleagues to talk about our India findings briefly.
Thanks, Maithil. As I said a little earlier, we spoke to users from semi and peri-urban regions, and as mentioned as well, most of these interviewees were people that we spoke to in focus group discussions of groups of around 8 to 10. Most of them were active smartphone users, but they didn't necessarily always have personal use of the phone. They might be sharing the phone with other people. This was often the case with women users. India, of course, has a myriad of languages with 22 official languages and thousands of other languages besides. So it's really challenging to do a kind of representative sample. So the states that we managed to cover in our study are kind of cover all north, south, east, and west, but obviously there's large portions of India that we couldn't cover due to exigencies of time. So just to take a quick look at the insights. So one thing that we found really interesting was that a majority of phone users used their phones in English. In India, 95% of phone usage is on Android, which means that most people are accessing the internet using, via Google or through the Google universe. And as some of you might be aware, Google has been making an effort to make more languages available, and it has been doing this in Indian languages. But despite the presence of Indian languages being available to users, majority still preferred to use their phones in English. And the reason for this is that that translated copy, that translated UX text, even though that's available, it is more confusing to users because the words that they are often rendered into or translated into are in a higher version of that language. So they're Sanskritized and they're not colloquial, they're not familiar. And therefore, they're much more alienating than English. Once users learned how to use an app, they weren't even necessarily reading the UX copy. They were just kind of navigating through, and it just have developed a kind of muscle memory of sorts. And so therefore the instructions that appear on the UX copy and on the interface became redundant. I think related to this, which is also mentioned in the insights, is that onboarding of new apps was frequently facilitated by peers and word of mouth. So unlike many Western English users, we might hear of an app and we go to the Google Play Store and download it. That is a lot less likely in these scenarios. What happens is that people will know or learn of certain apps that are gaining popularity or that are used very frequently. So during the course of our research, we found that taxi drivers were increasingly using Amazon Pay for payments. So they would either be onboarded by people they knew, like other taxi drivers or colleagues, or they would actually be people from the companies in whose interest it was to get them to adapt these tools. So basically, the kind of adoption of new apps is very centered on word of mouth or personal recommendations rather than kind of chancing upon an app or just trying something out for the sake of it. And the reason for this is that one of the major use cases in India for using technology right now is financial payments. So despite India not being a hugely advanced country when it comes to digital use, there's been a lot of investment and interest in making financial payments easily delivered through a unified payment gateway. And so most people are using these regardless of economic class status, etc., as long as they have smartphones. Therefore, the use of these apps for things like transactions does make it fraught for many users who are afraid that they might lose money or, put in the wrong figure or get, scammed by the use of these apps. And there have been cases of this. So users are quite nervous about this. And what this means is that if there's an issue during the use of these apps, then whatever they know of English is not enough to resolve that issue. That is where they get stuck. That is the pain point. In order for them to speak to somebody on a helpline or to understand the instructions that are more advanced than just the kind of usual instructions, to send or to upload, etc. Those that are familiar to them via icons. If it is out with that range of symbolic or linguistic understanding, then their usage can be very undermined and compromised. And the last thing that we'll mention right now is that minority language users are at a considerable disadvantage in India. As Mehta has mentioned, obviously language is very political, and it is the same here. There is a quest to push Hindi as the majority language, and most people, especially those who speak indigenous languages, are not being catered to when it comes to technology. So it isn't in the interests of, say, for example, corporations to develop Unicode for those languages, and as a consequence, those minority users are being forced into using state languages or those languages being pushed by national propaganda. Back to you, Beta.
Thank you so much, Padmini. And over to the next slide. So So given all of the different data that we collected from a considerable variety of contexts and people and experiences, we wanted to take that analysis of language use online and present design principles in lieu of recommendations, because these can inform stakeholders such as web designers, developers, and also help the average user who is going to be affected by these design choices in their day-to-day life. We hope that they then have the ability to make well-informed design choices for a more inclusive internet. So in this case, we just have a sample of our suggested design principles here. I recommend that if you want to read through them all, you can go through our main report on the microsite. But of course, these are divided into different categories based on our original research question and objectives and issues of accessibility, inclusivity, and trust and safety. So we recommend that there's more regional language keyboards refined, more applications should support local or minority languages. And that's really important to encourage both the use of languages that might be shut out or not have no ability to be used online. For inclusivity, we want to ensure that user research, such as this project, should also prioritize and include non-English speakers. So we would like companies to consider the end user, so the average user, rather than the users who are going to be the first to adopt technology or platforms, such as people who are educated, middle or upper class, and live in urban areas. The end user and the majority of users are also important in these considerations. We would like to see more digital safety and training mechanisms for users, especially those who do not speak English. This is an important aspect of policies work, especially in sub-Saharan Africa with our digital safety training and work against online gender-based violence. Another issue that would be great to be resolved or worked on is about voice recognition software that often doesn't recognize or translate local accents or different vernacular. And so having more of that data in software would be very supportive to ensuring that voices are heard and understood online. Lastly, for trust and safety mechanisms, having more legible and easy to use mechanisms for users to seek help, file complaints, get protection from harassment online, even if they do not speak or understand English. This includes making terms and conditions and user manuals easy to understand. Lastly, content moderation needs to be prioritized for low resource languages. We've already seen in contexts such as Myanmar and Ethiopia that without proper investment of content moderation in already fragile situations, the proliferation and incidence of hate speech online can often shift a conflict or a political schism even further. So these are just issues that we want to be considered as technology furthers and evolves and reaches even more people in the next decades to come. So with that, we want a better and more inclusive internet for those who do not speak, write, or read English at all or as a first language. And as I said before, that is only 16% of people on this planet. Everyone else already has spoken or knows a different language, and we need to be more accommodating of that, especially as our day-to-day lives are increasingly online or only online, as we are right now on Zoom. So with that, I want to encourage folks after this call, after this event, to go on our domain where we are hosting the entire report, including the framing paper, the case studies, and the design brief, as well as some very interesting comic book style graphics that go through the different user experiences, where you'll be able to access this on your own time. The domain is currently not live, so I recommend you wait a few hours to check it out, but it will be there for public use and consumption a few hours from now. So with that, I just want to thank my colleagues and all of the respondents who gave their time and energy into this project. I'm going to now pass it over to our moderator for the panel discussion to introduce our different panelists and also just to start a discussion around some questions about the use of non-majority languages online and how best to integrate their use into our digital space. Thank you so much, and over to you, Kola.
Hi, and thank you so much for an interesting discussion and for your work, from which I've learned a lot over the last year. I've learned a lot also about how language with technology works in other spaces that I'm not used to, like India. And I have a few questions, and I hope we can have an interesting conversation about it. I'm told I have 40 minutes, so I put a timer so I don't overrun the time. First, when we're talking about the ecosystem in Africa, the platform ecosystem, it has an inherent issue, which is the absence of set platforms on the continent. So Google, Facebook, Twitter, etc., are hosted in Silicon Valley and so far removed from the spaces where many of us use them, which probably informs why they're based in English and many of these languages other than the local language. And because of that, when we're addressing the issues, we end up addressing them in English, as we're doing now. And so how do you think we can solve that problem beyond just calling out the platforms for their lack of sensitivity to these spaces? How do you think the future can be better than it is now? Anyone can take that question.
Hi, I'm Jason, and I'll answer that question. So I think when it comes to the platform ecosystem in Africa, it's important to understand who the different stakeholders are. But to get straight to the point of your question, it's important for us to identify and understand who these platform developers are and what the incentives may be to develop these platforms. And then once we establish that, it's important to understand the broader context in which these platforms exist and are meant to thrive. When it comes to Africa, that context is one of poor analytics and data insights, and really an under-researched or lack of understanding about how Africans engage with and use technology. So once we consider that, and we also consider the fact that technological production still takes place in this very hub and spoke model where it's happening in the West, predominantly in the US or maybe in China, which is obviously not the West, and it's just being produced and given out to these end users who are Africans. These perspectives of Africans are not what's being centered in the product development phase. Even if end users are being considered, it is not African end users in particular whose perspectives are at the forefront of this. So when it comes to wanting to understand and address this issue, it's such a multifaceted issue because there are so many things to consider. Another point is also the socio-linguistic dynamics of Africa. I mean, Africa is such a diverse, ethnically diverse continent. So you add that to the mix and the fact that there isn't a clear incentive from different governments across the continent to support local languages and to invest in the development of local languages, it becomes a bit difficult to understand or to point fingers at who's supposed to be responsible for developing platforms. But at the same time, I think it speaks to the necessity of there being a multi-stakeholder approach in which it is not just the app developers, the likes of the Googles and the Metas, but it's also governments, it's also civil society, it's also people as an end users. So that would be my response to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Does anyone else want to add anything? I also want to add before you speak about the attitude. I think you mentioned that briefly, the attitude of the people who use the platforms as well. I used to work at Google, and I remember working on a project which localized the map for Nigerian English, and a number of Nigerians objected to the idea that the map would speak like them because they thought that the map should speak a foreign language and speak in a foreign accent. And so there are also people who think that, when you create things technology that they're used to enjoying as a foreign thing then speaks to them in a local language, they think of it as less than it should be, even though it's actually empowering many more people around them. So how do we deal with that colonial mentality, so to speak? Anyone want to take that?
Yeah, I can respond to that. I think what we noticed was that many of the people who said that they were using the phones in English were also doing so in a ploy to be able to learn English, because English is upward mobility for them. It is aspirational. It increases employment opportunities. We interviewed a group of women who all said that their children know English, so they want to know English. So it's absolutely, I think that is one reason why there isn't as much attention as there should be being paid to kind of national or local or native languages. One thing that I do just want to add, coming back to the previous point, as to who can play a part in improving the situation, language activists in India, for example, have been very key to keeping certain indigenous languages alive, reviving them, putting them online. I noticed that there's somebody from Wikimedia. The Wikipedia community in India has been quite active in ensuring that there's Unicode versions of languages that are spoken by a handful of people, for example. So language activists are very, very crucial to the way that we perceive and find languages online in India as well.
Thank you very much. That's a very crucial point. Claudia, you want to say something?
Yes, thank you, Kola. Hello, everyone. I am Claudia Pozo. I am coordinator of the Language Justice Program at Whose Knowledge. I am from Bolivia. Yeah, thank you for including me in this event and conversation. Happy to be here. So what I want to offer is our entry point to this analysis at Whose Knowledge, which is what we call language justice, which basically means to recognize that the world, and particularly digital technologies, do not really understand and they do not represent the deep and breadth and richness of languages that are not English, and in general that are not really European colonial languages, right? And in particular, the languages that are spoken by billions of people in Africa, in South Asia, and in other regions in the global majority world. So there is a very clear exclusion of languages in digital technologies. And I think it is important to connect that with what we can learn from history and the historical and the ongoing issues around power. The fact that most of the technology, including language technologies that we use today, are developed, as you were mentioning earlier, Kola, in countries that are mainly located in the global north, but not only the countries regionally speaking, but also the values of white people in the global north, clearly result in these technologies not being accessible, not being appealing, not being important and meaningful to most of us living in the global south or the global majority of the world, right? And in that sense, I think it is just in a way natural that many people don't feel appeal of using certain platforms and certain tools because it's not only an issue of access or accessibility itself, right? It's also an issue of how these tools really respond to the ways of being and doing and understanding the world of these many different communities, including indigenous nations, right? So it's not only a fact of translations, it is not only an issue on accessibility, it's also an issue of many other aspects around usability, around development of the different tools, and around justice at the end. We prefer to use the term justice and knowledge depth, for example, instead of inclusion, because inclusion entails that there is already a given structure that needs to include, right, needs to bring more different aspects of humanity. But in fact, we like to really challenge the main structure that now on top of which the internet is built right now. So I will just pause there.
Thank you, Claudia. Does anyone else want to say something before I move on? Ajita? Okay, let me not put anyone else on the spot. Let's ask, how do we achieve meaningful inclusion? I ask this because, like we said, you know, they're the big guys in charge of setting the agenda seem to be far away, and occasionally they get, you know, one or two people in, you know, who belong to these communities, but not put them in places where they can actually make decisions. So I'll give an example of Google Translate, for instance, which is an engineering-based project. And most people assume that there are people behind it who like ensure the translations work well, but usually an engineering and statistical issue, which is why many African languages don't turn out, you know, good translations out of it, because we're not using human beings in charge of it, but, you know, working with data we can find and scrape online, of which there are not many for African languages. So that's a problem, another problem entirely. So how do we achieve meaningful inclusion then? What is a long-term goal to get into these spaces, or to create our own systems if possible? What do you think is a long-term future prognosis, or do you think all is just lost and all we can do is complain? Anyone? Hello, everybody can hear me, right? Okay, no one is taking this one. So my question is, how do we solve the problem long term? I mean, we do this research, we show the problems that exist, the social linguistic problems. Somebody's raised their hand. Okay, who is that? Padme, you want to say something, Padme?
Sure. No, hopefully all is not lost. I think, you know, one of the big issues, of course, is that, as I said earlier, the whole ecosystem that we operate in India is owned by Google, because unlike other countries, we're also a mobile first country. So when we came online to mobile devices directly. There was no laptop moment for India, for example, or desktop. So we are completely kind of hemmed in by the realities of Google owning the ecosystem. So it does kind of depend very strongly on decisions that are taken at organizations such as Meta or Google. But I do think, and I hope that this has come through, that this is also a design question. I think there has been a tendency to look at this question more through only the kind of the lens of language and language alone. But what we have to also think about, I think, as Claudia was mentioning, is that visual vocabularies are also different for different communities and different ways of understanding the world, right? So, you know, certain kind of iconography, which might be very simple for somebody in the West to understand, might not make any sense to somebody elsewhere in the global South. So I think one thing that we do need to do and, you know, think more deeply about is that what does it mean to create indigenous designed products in our own countries? How do we use, say, open source and other spaces like, again, places like Wikipedia to advocate for, to fill those gaps from the bottom up rather than, you know, the top down, which is either corporations or the government, right? So I do believe that organizations like Whose Knowledge and Wikipedia can, you know, play a really big role in altering the fabric of this ecosystem, even though it's not coming from a corporate space. And everyone can contribute to those spaces, right? So there is potential, but I think there also just needs to be an awareness that we can shift things. I think there is this, especially for, you know, kind of generations coming online, there's this sense that everything is in stone and they can't change anything because they're not used to a read-write internet. And we need to kind of be able to make younger generations aware that they can shift things on the internet by crowdsourcing, by using open source tools, etc.
Do you want to answer that question by Maya on
Sure. Yes, yeah. Thanks, Maya, for the question. And it's actually very interesting that this is the case that you flagged up. So for those of you who haven't seen the question, she's basically saying that the problem statement seems solid, but the CoWIN app, which was used for availing the COVID vaccine in India, was only rolled out in English in India. And yet there was, a significant uptake of the vaccination process. Funnily enough, Maya, you haven't read the report, but in the report, that is actually the example that we use. And the reason why we use this is that I speak Bengali, and I looked for, on Google, I looked for how do I get the COVID vaccination in Bengali. The top result was the government mandated result. And 3 or 4 out of, I think, the 9 links that were shown to us were links from other countries where they had translated how to get a vaccination in those countries into Bengali. So for example, Seattle is having a rollout of vaccination and they have a significant Bengali population. So they've translated stuff into Bengali. And that is what comes up on the first page of search results. And I think this is something that we've also tried to address in the report, which is, the crucial role that something like search plays in compromising our experience of the internet, the kind of knowledge that it delivers to us. And as we're seeing, that's getting even more risky with things like ChatGPT, etc., because search is not reliable. And if you are somebody who doesn't speak the language enough to be able to make a choice between 2 different sources of news and be able to tell which is right and which is wrong, then we are in a very, very fraught situation. So Maya, to answer your question about the uptake of the COVID vaccination, I think there are a lot more agencies involved, like NGOs, like ASHA workers who are frontline health workers, etc. It wasn't only the availability of the app. There were many people who helped other people get onto these apps and register. You could go directly to clinics and register. So it wasn't only a success of the app itself. So I think that just goes to show that while there is some impact, that impact comes with a lot of kind of possible pitfalls, such as fake information and misinformation.
Thank you very much. There was something I used to speak about in Nigeria, which I noticed, which was caused by me noticing that many of the products that came in from outside usually had like sometimes foreign languages on their manual. So you buy a TV and then all the manual is in Korean or in Chinese, etc. And I often wondered why there were no mandates by the government, for instance, to make sure that the people who were bringing products in the country, had them translated into local language. I was thinking about this when also thinking about online use and safety, where many people who use the internet have to read like terms and conditions in a language that they may not speak as a first language, and they have to like accept before they can move on to be able to use it. What is the impact of this on safety online? And how do you think we can solve this problem when many of these people don't have agency because they're already by the device and these things don't exist in their language and they have to accept? And sometimes they're accepting releasing their data and their, the impact for surveillance and a number of other things. Does anyone want to take that?
Can I? Sure.
Yes,
I will try answer that question, at least part of it. So I think part of it's human nature that you don't really know that you need something until you're in a situation that you need it. And so I think that's the perspective that I want to lead with. So first and foremost, the reality is just that what needs to start happening is that the tools that people need to mitigate this risk needs to be available in local languages. I think that's the first and foremost thing that needs to be done, whether it is health and safety guidelines, or whether this is like certain features that people can make use of when they feel like they're in danger. It needs to be available in local languages. But of course, that's not the entirety of the picture. Because people also need training on how to use these things. And that training would also be embedded into how they use this in the context of where this technology is being implemented. So to this end, what I would say is that it's really important for developers, technology developers, platform developers to understand that risks are not universal, and that country-specific or regional-specific risks can only be mitigated by developing a nuanced understanding of what these issues are and what these issues represent. And you can only do that by having people from those places who understand those issues and the nuance in those issues in the room. So I'll take an example of this, and it was mentioned previously or a bit earlier on. So we spoke to some university students in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, and we were trying to understand whether there's been an increase in local language content and the impact that that's had, and what are the dynamics that have kind of shaped and influenced that. And there was a consensus in the room that there has been an increase in local language content, whether that's in Amharic or Romo. But once we delved a little bit deeper into the question and the dynamics underlying that, we realized that a lot of that content is political content. And it was content that was fueling ethnic divides, and that made a lot of these, these people that we were talking to feel very unsafe. And they spoke about how they would flag that content, particularly content on like TikTok or maybe Facebook, and nothing would be done about it because the safety and community guidelines were not being violated in English. So the technology couldn't pick up that there was actually an issue there. And that speaks to the fact that, well, the technology is there. Perhaps one would say, well, we've put the community guidelines out and anyone can make use of it and report it. But the fact that there lacks that nuanced understanding of issues, and there's this very universal perception of what risks are, that means the technology falls flat in this context. It doesn't do anything. If anything, people use and abuse the system because they know that they can get away with it. So it's not enough to just offer, the tools to mitigate the risk and to train people on how to use it, but it is important to develop an understanding that these risks are not universal. And by bringing people into the room, answering the previous question, through that inclusion, and by having the representatives from these different communities and contexts in the room to help like sift through this stuff and add the nuance, then that's how you kind of answer these solutions, or you produce solutions. And I mean, some people might say there isn't the incentive to do that, but according to a GSMA report from 2022, there's 650 million mobile users in Africa. If there's no economic case with 650 million people, then I think it just means that the people don't want to do it. Yeah, so that would be my response.
Great points. Anyone else?
I would like to add to that.
Yes.
So I think Jason is raising like very, very important issues around safety. And I will add that in general, proprietary and profit-driven motivations do not result in tools and technologies that offer deep and nuanced content in different marginalized languages and from marginalized communities. We know that most of the mainstream big social media platforms, they don't, for long at least, they didn't have a policies which reflected that they cared enough about the consequence of the lack of local language expertise and context within their teams and their processes. And this, as we know, led to quite big harm and active violence in different communities around the world. So one part of the problem is that language tech is rarely designed for marginalized languages. And it also is designed in a top-down approach, prioritizing profit over equity and safety. And this top-down approach, rarely understands the context in which marginalized languages and marginalized communities live in, and the differences of design. They also need to bring, they need to find a way to bring languages online in a rich and nuanced way, because languages are highly contextual. So it isn't enough for us just to access information. It's also important for us to be able to create content in our own languages, because that is one way in which we can offer content that is not harmful, that is safer for many communities, and especially thinking about those people who are sitting at the intersections of many marginalized communities regarding gender identities or class or caste aims and many other forms of marginalization. So what does it mean for these groups of people not only not to be able to access different platforms in their own languages, but also not being able to create content that is meaningful for them and their communities, right?
Thank you, Claudia. I have a question here for India, and I am told Ajita will be able to answer that. It says the public school system in India is broken, leading to a huge gap in language proficiency, even off local languages. It's similar to what happens in Nigeria as well. So to bridge the gap, the muscle memory and peer support leads to a new language, which is a mix of local language and English. And moving either way becomes difficult. So how do we handle this in the short term so that the current users can really push movement towards local languages?
Thanks, Kola, and thanks, Amita, for that question. So actually, we spoke to a lot of informal workers across many states in India whose main language was not English. They were speaking a variety of languages like Bhojpuri, Haryanvi, so dialects as well, not just major languages. And we found that even though most of them were actually speaking Hindi quite well, they did not prefer to use the apps in Hindi, even though they could translate or just like switch the language support in Hindi. And one of the major reasons for this was that this version of Hindi that the developers were using on the apps was too difficult or just too foreign for them to understand. It was the Sanskritized version of Hindi, which was too pure, quote unquote, and they could not relate to it. So I think the kind of the version of language that you're talking about, which is a mix of local language and English, is actually what people are speaking now, and they would prefer to actually read their app copies in that because that's the language that they're relating to. Also, I wanted to add to Padmini's point about the Covin uptake. We also spoke to a lot of users, informal workers around the Covin app, and we found that none of them were actually going on the Covin website and booking vaccination slots for themselves. They were either asking their employers to do this for them, or a lot of residents associations, the RWAs across major metropolitan cities were organizing vaccination drives for the people working in the neighborhood in that area for them. So the actual website was not being accessed by a lot of people who were not speaking, who were like not English users, and language wasn't the major reason for it. It became one, of course, but right from digital access to a lack of digital skills and digital literacy was also a huge contributing factor.
Thank you. Maytal, you wanted to say something?
No, excuse me. I just wanted to chime in, and I'm really enjoying the responses so far. And I agree, inclusion is not a one step, one band-aid, one fix to making sure the internet is accessible for people of all languages and abilities and demographics. But I think a lot of the steps that we talk about in our design brief and steps that technology companies and other stakeholders can take to ensure that, you know, minoritized languages can have a better chance at being represented online is really important. And that manifests in a lot of different ways. You see a lot of work being done by Indigenous groups in North America, for example, to preserve endangered languages and to proliferate them among younger generations. I've seen this with Cherokee, Hawaiian, and other languages. You also see more localized applications where efforts by governments, such as in Tanzania with their Swahili board, that is a government body to ensure that government documents and services are available in Swahili. So I think efforts like that are different steps for ensuring that co-creation happens, localization happens, and more people are able to access these tools online. I think with that, just a note on where we are with time. As much as I would love to spend 8 hours talking about this and continue this conversation, I think if we could, if you don't mind opening it up for audience to maybe ask questions, that would be fantastic. So we can wrap up on time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I saw a few hands up earlier in the chat. I don't know how we can bring them up to ask their questions. That would be great. think there are about 2 hands up somewhere in there. I don't know how to accept them, so let me know.
I think we can maybe start, we can just read out the questions that have been written.
There's one more
from
question,
Chris.
Yes,
Yeah.
please. Says, what advice do you have for efforts to include underrepresented languages in terms of funding? Because funding is one major issue for these efforts. Does anyone want to take this? Because again, from my experience in the field, funding that comes from corporations go to the interest they already have in profit making, and usually it's also always tilted. But what I would ask, a counter question to that is, what are governments doing? Governments who are in the best place to understand the language situation of their country. If there's a problem there, many governments also have this bias towards the majority language, sometimes the language of the leaders or their people and stuff like that. And it affects how they look at this language situation of the country. Why don't we have more public support for many of these efforts that help empower these local languages that exist in these countries? Anyone want to say something about that?
I can just very quickly respond to the first part of the question around funding. Something that we are seeing in India is the realization that advertising, if advertising is in Indian languages, it obviously means more money for advertisers, right? So there are now companies who are in this niche area where they are focusing on developing advertisements for voice as well as for visual. So on YouTube, for example, translating ads is actually bringing in a lot of money. So that is one revenue stream that might encourage people to invest more in local language advertising. Again, like we've been saying before, this is obviously skewed towards majority languages. It's very unlikely to be towards minority languages, but it is still shifting the needle slightly.
Thank you. Anyone else? Please put your questions in the Q&A so that we can see them, if we can bring you up to ask. I have one final question, and then I'll hand over to Meta to wrap up. And this is a paradox, basically, of the situation where you have, when you look online today, you have Hausa, Igbo, many of these languages from these communities show up online, not in the right size and quality and even quantity that we want, but they do show up, occasionally, and then occasionally there are grants and places to support many of these spaces. What do you see as the possibility that even empowering local languages sometimes even end up, disempowering some even smaller languages in those spaces? So in the end, some languages rise up to the top and some still get left behind in spite of all our best efforts. Are we just agreeing that technology just happens to, it's just always going to leave some languages behind no matter what we do? And how do we mitigate that? Anyone? That's my last question.
That's a very... Yeah, if I may, that's a very interesting question, actually. What I like to offer is a thought on scalability and how, because of globalization and capitalism and this idea of very big things, we are always thinking about scaling things as much as possible, right? But some things really cannot be scaled or can be scaled until a point and then no more. And I think it happens with languages as well, that some languages and some language communities would like to be on the internet and would decide to be on the internet and share their knowledges online. And some communities may not, right? And I think that all different players in this scene, we need to really recognize that and honor that as well. And I think the question with languages isn't really how would platforms or tools support more languages, but it really should be more like how would they really support the over 7,000 languages that there are in the world, because the technology would allow for that. It's only that the process and the dreaming behind it is not yet there. But I do think it's possible, right? It's only a shift in the narrative of what is possible that we need to bring forward. And I think I will, yes, as I just close my participation in this event, I would just really like to congratulate you guys for the friends and folks for the report. And I'm really happy to know more about it and to see the many intersections it has with the State of the Internet Languages report that we at Whose Knowledge launched back in 2022. And also part of it is, as of now, available in international sign. So I think it's really good to see that we are just kind of joining efforts towards finding a more, just making the internet more multilingual, multimodal, and really a better place to be.
Thank you so much. And on that note, I'm going to hand over back to Metal. I've had a good time moderating and learning from you guys, and thank you for the work you do. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Kola. I want to briefly address one last question before I hand it to our panelists to maybe give any closing remarks or reflections before we wrap up. Of course, as I'm going to say yet again, I would love to have a debate, a conversation about this all day, but we'll just have to continue this conversation another time. Bobina asked a really good question about what role do we think government has to play in addressing these challenges of language inclusion online. I will just briefly touch upon it, and then I'm going to pass it over to Padmini, Arjita, Claudia, and Jason to maybe offer some closing reflection and remarks. But the government does have, or governments of different countries do have a role to play, but I personally do not think we can put too much weight into the role of government, because as we have talked about time and time again throughout this webinar, throughout our work, is that language is so often politicized and can be manipulated by those in power, not just government, but also big tech, other stakeholders in our globalized world, to ensure that certain languages, certain words, certain phrases are elevated over others. And that is a really risky territory. Of course, we can have institutions like academia and educational systems that prioritize indigenous languages or regional languages in primary and secondary school, or funding programs to revitalize languages. As I said, that's been going on a lot in indigenous communities in the Americas, which I find extremely fascinating, but was a bit out of the wheelhouse of this study. So I think it just requires a bit of care by governments and by the civil society actors trying to keep these governments accountable to ensure that there's an equitable approach taken to have representation of all sides and also accommodate all sorts of communities and demographics within the languages that they speak. So with that, I'm just going to pass it over to our panelists, who I'm grateful for being here today, and for the work that you have done to contribute to both this project and the broader issue at large. And then we can wrap up. So let's start with maybe you, Jason. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this panel, and it was incredible being a part of the research as well. I'm so happy to see how it's concluded and offered so many insights and shared so many perspectives. I'll just close this by saying I'm very optimistic about the role and the potential of technology. I mean, we're here having a conversation across 4 different continents and multiple time zones, which is not something that would have been possible decades ago. And so I think I also want to lead with that in terms of what the possibilities are for language. We might not be able to bring all 7,000 languages on board, but as technology evolves and as we bring a couple of languages on board, the possibilities become more endless, and the opportunities to use that as a baseline to do other things in terms of language technology will only grow with time. But the incentive needs to be there, and the groundwork and the fundamentals at least need to be established in the in the future that we can control. So I'm a bit optimistic about that. So I just want to thank the team again for the opportunity, and it was great chatting to you and seeing you all again. And yeah, thanks.
Over to you, Padmini.
Oh, I was going to let Arjita go first. Arjita, do you want to take it?
Oh yeah, of course. please.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Padmini. And thanks, Matel, Jason, and Claudia for being here, and Kola for moderating this. It's been an absolutely wonderful time being part of this study for the past year or so. I've had the opportunity to do field work on this and speaking to a variety of different people, and it's been a really, really enlightening experience for me. Just to add to Matel's point about the role of governments, I don't know too much about this, but I do see the Welsh government. I've been reading some things about the Welsh government pushing for a million or is it 10 million people, Welsh speaking people in the country by 2050. And they're doing this by making more jobs, pushing the language in schools, partnering with technologies like Duolingo. And of course, the socio-economic conditions of Wales differ very drastically from our contexts. But I think it can still be a solid, small blueprint for how things should go. Also, additionally, I think when we're talking about language inclusion and digital inclusion, we're barely just beginning to scratch the surface. We're thinking of language as, how do we think of language as just a copy, like a UX copy? But what does it mean to provide language inclusion for disabled individuals? Not just sign language support, but also how to make the best possible applications for visually impaired folks, how to support them best in their usage of screen readers, because a terribly designed website would completely make a screen reader's experience very chaotic and unpleasant. So I think when we're talking about language inclusion, digital inclusion, really forgetting disability would do a huge disservice for a large population also. And I think those are my closing remarks. Thank you so much, everyone, once again.
Great, thanks so much, Ajita. Yes, and actually on that note, I was speaking to some colleagues at Enable India, which is a disability NGO, the other day, and we just realized that something like voice search, which is gaining popularity in India because you don't have to be literate to use it, is something that people with disabilities are completely disadvantaged at using. So even these new kind of seemingly silver bullet solutions need to have a lot of work done to increase inclusivity. I think the last thing that I would like to say is that it's obviously wonderful, and we hope that people will advocate for their rights and for their for more kind of environments or digital ecosystems that work for them. But I do think that in order for that to happen, people need to be more aware of what it is that they need to make a digital ecosystem that works for them, right? And so in our recommendations in the design brief, we've also spoken about just educating people on, what does a fair internet look like, so that they know how to advocate and lobby for it. Because without that knowledge, it's very difficult to approach governments or technology corporations and ask for change. So I would just say and strongly encourage people to, and educate people as much as possible on what the fair internet could look like. Thanks. And thanks so much, everyone. It's been a wonderful project, and I've really enjoyed working with all of you. And let's hope it's the start of many more.
Over to you, Claudia, if you have anything you'd like to end with.
Well, I think I offered some sort of closing remarks already, but I would like to offer a very short thought, because I think what Ajita raised is really important in this conversation. And so, well, I think most of the languages in the world are transmitted in spoken or signed forms and not through writing. And I think that's very important to always have in mind, that even though that is true, the internet remains a very text-heavy, text-oriented place to be. And what that means for people whose languages are mainly oral or textual or gestural, right? So I do think we need to continue doing this power analysis of why the internet is like that. Why does it benefit some languages more than others? And what can we do to resist that, right? And I just want to make an invite to really dream big about the possibilities of tech, and especially language tech. As Jason was saying, let's stay positive and yeah, let's just continue these conversations. Thank you so much for having me here.
Thank you so much, Claudia, Padmini, Urjita, Jason, Kola, everyone who has contributed or taken part in this research. It's been an absolute pleasure. I also want to again thank the many, many respondents that contributed to this research, whether through the people that have worked on the illustrations you'll see on the website, our microsite designer, but also the dozens of people we interviewed, talked to, consulted, or had more informal conversations with. It was all extremely valuable and really underlines the fact that all this knowledge is really important for building a more inclusive internet. We are going to share the slides with everyone who attended today shortly, and also the URL for the microsite should be live hopefully in a few hours. We had some technical issues, but those are being resolved as we speak. With that, I'm going to close this off, and thank you so much for attending and everyone's valuable insights. Have a lovely Tuesday evening or Tuesday day, wherever you are. Thank you.